He built an empire on fear. He controlled every room, every deal, every man who dared stand against him. Kang Jae-min was untouchable, the ghost that Seoul's underworld whispered about and prayed they'd never meet. But 12 years ago, he made one decision that no amount of power could ever undo. He looked into the eyes of the only woman who ever saw past the violence, past the walls, past the legend, and he let her walk away. Now she's back, and the man who fears nothing is terrified. If you've ever loved someone and lost them because of your own cowardice, this story will break you open. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end, because what happens next will shake you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The first thing Kang Jae-min noticed about the flight announcement was how ordinary it sounded. Gate 14B, Seoul, Incheon International. Arrival from New York, delayed by 40 minutes due to weather over the Pacific. He wasn't at the airport. He was standing in the floor-to-ceiling window of his 53rd floor office, holding a glass of water he hadn't touched, watching the Han River catch the last of the afternoon light, like something slow and indifferent to everything happening above it. His assistant had told him about the flight because he'd asked her to track it. He hadn't explained why. Park Soo-yeon had worked for him for 6 years and understood that certain questions weren't questions. They were the sound of a door he didn't intend to open. He set the glass down. 40 minutes. As if the universe wanted him to sit a little longer with what was coming. Jae-min was 41 years old. He had built Kang Stone Group from a mid-tier trading company into one of the 10 most powerful private conglomerates in South Korea. That was the version of him that appeared in financial publications, that attended government dinners, that gave careful and unrevealing interviews to journalists who were always slightly afraid of him without being able to explain why. The other version of him, the one that controlled 4 of Seoul's most lucrative underground networks, that had negotiated with men whose names never appeared in any legal document, that had made decisions in back rooms that rearranged entire power structures across the city. That version didn't give interviews. That version only appeared when someone made the mistake of thinking Jae-min's public face was the whole man. Both versions of him had one thing in common. They had spent 12 years not thinking about Amara Whitfield, which meant, of course, that he had thought about her constantly. He turned away from the window and sat down at his desk. There was a photograph on the left corner that had been there for 4 years. Him and Ethan Cross at a mountain resort in Gangwon Province, both of them squinting into the sun, Ethan's arms slung over his shoulder the way it always had been since they were 22, and studying economics in the same building, and decided, for reasons neither of them could later articulate, that they were going to be brothers. The friendship had survived business pressures, rival interests. The year Jae-min's organization had gone to war with a syndicate in Busan, and the one conversation that had nearly destroyed everything. The conversation 12 years ago when Ethan had found out what happened between his sister and his best friend. Or rather, what hadn't happened. Jae-min picked up the photograph, studied it for a moment, and set it face down on the desk. He wasn't sure why he did that. He told himself it was meaningless. The wedding was in 6 days. Ethan was marrying Ji-soo Han, a corporate attorney who wore her intelligence like armor, and had, over the 3 years of their relationship, become the only woman Jae-min had ever watched Ethan be genuinely afraid of disappointing. She was exacting, precise, and kind in the specific way that people are kind when they have chosen kindness deliberately rather than stumbled into it. Jae-min respected her. He was serving as best man, which meant the week ahead involved a rehearsal dinner, 2 separate family events, and 6 days of being inside the same house, Ethan's family estate in Seongbuk, with a woman who had every reason to despise him. He'd known Amara was coming for 3 months. Ethan had told him directly, with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided he wasn't going to manage the situation for either of them. "She's my sister," Ethan had said, on the phone, without preamble. "She's going to be here for the whole week. I'm telling you so you can, I don't know. Do whatever you need to do." He'd paused. "Or don't." Jae-min had said that was fine. It wasn't fine to him. She came through the main gate of the estate at 6:30 in the evening, while the household staff was moving luggage and Ethan's mother was directing everyone with the focused energy of a general overseeing an operation. Jamin was standing on the upper terrace with a glass of scotch he was actually drinking this time, and he saw her before she saw him. 12 years rearranged a person. He knew that. He'd seen it in himself often enough. Photographs from his 30s showed a man still performing authority, still wearing hardness like a costume. The face in the mirror now was different, settled into what it was. Less performance, more architecture. Amara Whitfield had done the same thing, except the version she'd settled into was stunning in a way that hit him somewhere below the sternum and stayed there. She was 36. She wore a camel-colored coat over a dark dress, her natural hair pulled back with a few strands loose at her temples, and she moved through the courtyard with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned, through significant effort, exactly how much space she was allowed to take up. She was laughing at something Ethan's mother had said, one hand touching the older woman's arm, and the laugh was real, not performed, not diplomatic. The laugh he remembered. Lower than you'd expect, like something that surprised even her when it came out. He didn't move. He watched her scan the courtyard the way people do when they're orienting themselves, cataloging exits and familiar faces, and then her eyes came up to the terrace. She found him immediately. He didn't know what he expected. Flinching, maybe. The particular freeze of someone who wasn't ready. What he got instead was a long, steady look that lasted exactly 3 seconds. And then she turned back to Ethan's mother and continued the conversation as if nothing had interrupted it. That was worse than anything else she could have done. Jamin drank his scotch and went back inside. Dinner that night was 12 people around a table that fit 14, which meant everyone was close enough to be aware of everyone else. Ethan's family occupied one end. His mother, 2 aunts, a cousin who worked in Daejeon and spent most of the meal on his phone. And the wedding party spread outward from there. Jisoo's parents had arrived that afternoon and sat near the center, with the careful posture of people determined to be gracious in an environment that was not quite theirs. Jisoo herself sat beside Ethan and spent most of the meal in the particular mode she had when she was working, attentive, precise, her fingers occasionally brushing Ethan's wrist when the conversation needed redirecting. Jamin sat at the far end, which was where he usually sat when a room was too full of variables. Amara sat across from him and 3 seats down. She was talking to Marcus Hale, who had flown in from London and who Jamin knew through Ethan as a financial consultant with a talent for making complicated things sound simple and a social ease that Jamin had never possessed and had long since stopped wanting. Marcus was the kind of man who laughed with his whole face, who leaned in when he talked to you, who made every person in his radius feel immediately accounted for. He was doing all of those things with Amara, and she was responding to it the way people respond to warmth when they've been in a cold room. Not desperately, but gratefully, settling into it. Jamin focused on his food. Ethan's cousin asked him something about the Kangstone Group's recent acquisition in Incheon. He answered it. He didn't remember what he said. Across the table, Amara laughed again at something Marcus said. Not the full laugh, just a quieter version. A concession of amusement. And Jamin cut his meat with slightly more force than the situation required. After dinner, the group moved to the main sitting room where Ethan's mother had arranged fruit and tea in the way she always did, which meant the gathering would last another 90 minutes, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Jamin stationed himself near the bookshelves with a cup of tea he didn't want, watching the room redistribute itself into the smaller conversations that always formed after large meals. The comfortable ones, the obligatory ones, the ones between people who weren't sure what they were to each other yet. He didn't intend to speak to Amara that night. He had a plan. The plan was distance, civil, professional, the appropriate courtesy between 2 adults who had a shared history and had both decided to leave it where it was. He would be present and functional and completely contained. And at the end of the week, Ethan would be married, and Amara would go back to New York, and Jamin would go back to his empire. And that would be the end of it. The plan lasted until she walked over. She stopped 2 feet away from him, held her tea with both hands, and looked at him directly. Up close, she was more exhausted than she'd appeared at dinner. The skin under her eyes carried a faint shadow, and her jaw was set with the particular tension of someone who had made a decision and was going to execute it before they could talk themselves out of it. "Jamin," she said. Just his name. No title, no formality, no padding. "Amara," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I want you to know that I'm not here for whatever this week might make you think I'm here for. I'm here for Ethan. I'm going to be present and happy for my brother in Jisoo, and I'm not going to make anything difficult. I don't need anything from you." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in years that wasn't about business. He said, "I know. I just didn't want there to be any confusion." "There isn't." She studied him. Her eyes were the same, dark brown, direct, the kind of eyes that had always made him feel seen in a way he didn't know how to categorize. "Good," she said. And then she turned and walked back across the room to where Marcus was talking to Jisoo's father about something that involved a lot of hand gestures. Jamin stood with his cold tea and understood with precise, unwelcome clarity that his plan was already broken. That night he sat on the edge of his bed in the guest room they'd given him, third floor, east wing, overlooking the garden, and let himself, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, actually think about 12 years ago. He'd been 29. She'd been 24. He'd already been building the underground side of his operation for 3 years, and there were men in Seoul who were beginning to fear him, and men in other cities who were beginning to learn his name, and he had understood with cold clarity that the life he was building had a specific cost structure, that the people who mattered to him would be targets, that getting close to him was a form of danger, and that the only way to protect the people he loved was to enforce a certain distance. He had believed all of that. He still believed most of it. Amar had come to him on a Tuesday afternoon in late October in the small office he kept above a restaurant in Mapo. She hadn't called ahead. She'd told his man at the door that she needed 5 minutes, and his man had let her in because she was Ethan Cross's sister, and that had always been enough. She'd stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on and her hands loose at her sides, and she'd looked at him and said, "I need to tell you something, and then I need you to be honest with me." He'd said okay. She'd said she had feelings for him, that she'd had them for over a year, that she knew what he was, not everything, but enough, and that she wasn't asking him to be different. She was asking him if there was anything there worth acknowledging. He'd sat behind his desk and looked at her, and felt something he didn't have clean language for, a specific density of feeling that pushed against the inside of his chest and that he had immediately, methodically buried. He'd said, "You should go back to New York, Amara." He'd said it quietly, not cruelly, but without giving her anything to hold. She'd stood there for a moment, then she'd nodded once, the way people nod when they're agreeing to something they didn't agree to choose, and she'd walked out. Ethan had called him 3 days later, voice flat, to tell him Amara had booked a flight. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Jamin lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He'd told himself he'd made the right choice. He'd told himself 100 times, in 100 different circumstances, across 12 years of building something that required him to be a person who made hard choices efficiently and without the luxury of second-guessing. The right choice didn't usually feel, 12 years later, like a stone lodged somewhere behind the sternum. He was up before 6. He ran. 4 kilometers through the estate's grounds in the early cold, his breath coming in visible bursts, the gravel loud under his feet. He ran until his lungs were raw and his legs were tight, and the night's thinking was beaten down to something quieter, something he could keep under the surface where it belonged. He was cooling down near the garden wall when he heard footsteps on the path and turned. Amara. She was in running clothes, dark tights, a gray half-zip, earbuds around her neck. And she was clearly just returning from her own run, her forehead damp, her breathing still elevated. She stopped when she saw him. The garden in early morning had a specific quality of light, silver, horizontal, without warmth yet, that made everything look more exposed than it actually was. They stood about 12 feet apart. "You run," he said. It was a stupid thing to say. He said it anyway. 8 years, she said, early. I like quiet. He understood that. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Sleep okay?" She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read and said, Why are you asking me that? I don't know, he said, which was honest. She held his gaze for a 3 count. Then she said, no, and walked past him toward the house. He stood in the garden and watched her go, the cold settling back around him, and felt something shift in his chest. Something old and poorly buried finally starting to move toward the surface, whether he wanted it to or not. Inside the house, a door closed. Upstairs, Marcus Hale's room light came on. Jamin turned back toward the garden wall and stood there until his hands were cold, thinking about what Ethan had said to him 6 months ago, unprompted, over drinks in Gangnam. She never really talked about you after she left. You know what that means, right? He hadn't answered then. He didn't have an answer now. But for the first time in 12 years, Kang Jae-min wasn't sure he could keep pretending he didn't want one. The cold didn't leave the garden until nearly 8, and by then the house had already started its noise. Kitchen sounds, water through pipes, the particular shuffle of a household waking up under the pressure of a week that mattered. Jae-min was the last one to come inside. He showered, changed, and came down to the dining room to find it already half occupied. Ethan's mother was at the head of the table with a schedule printout and a pen she kept clicking. Jisoo's younger sister was picking at fruit and scrolling her phone. Marcus Hale was pouring coffee at the sideboard with the comfortable ease of a man who made himself at home everywhere he went, and he turned when Jae-min walked in and said, "Morning. Sleep well?" "Fine," Jae-min said. "Good house for it." Marcus handed him a cup without being asked, the way people do when they're either genuinely generous or performing generosity. Jae-min took the cup and couldn't decide which it was. "Ethan says you two go back to university. That's a long run." 20 years, Jae-min said. "You can tell. He talks about you like your infrastructure." Marcus said it with a grin that had no edge in it. Something that's just been there so long it's part of the foundation. Jae-min looked at him. Marcus Hale was 40, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably always been trustworthy and had only gotten more so with age. He had no idea what Jae-min was beneath the surface. Most people didn't. The ones who knew didn't pour him coffee and make easy conversation about foundations. "Where's Ethan?" Jae-min asked. "Ran into town with Jisoo, some florist thing, back by 10. Marcus sat down across from him with his own cup. "So what's your role this week?" "Beyond best man." "What do you mean?" "I mean Ethan's got a schedule that looks like a military operation. There's got to be assigned duties." "Rehearsal dinner is Thursday. I give a speech." Jae-min paused. "I wrote 3 versions." Marcus raised an eyebrow. 3? "The first one was too formal. The second was too personal. The third is probably still wrong." Marcus looked at him with something that might have been surprise and then laughed. A real one, short and genuine. "I didn't expect that from you." "Most people don't expect much from me," Jae-min said, and drank his coffee. Amara came in 6 minutes later. She was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, her hair down today, and the glasses she wore when she wasn't performing anything. Thin-framed, slightly too large for her face, which was something he'd noticed 12 years ago and apparently hadn't stopped noticing. She went to the sideboard, poured tea, and turned to find the table occupied and both men looking at her, and handled it the way she handled most things now, without changing her face. "Morning," she said, to the table generally. Marcus said, "Morning, come sit. We're solving the great mystery of Jae-min's speech." She sat. Not next to Jae-min. Not across from him. The corner seat which put her equidistant from both of them, which told him she'd made a calculation. "What's the mystery?" she asked. "He wrote 3 versions and still thinks they're all wrong." She glanced at Jae-min. It was a brief glance, the kind that gathers information without committing to a direction. "What's wrong with them?" Jae-min said, "Nothing's wrong with them. They're just not right." "That's not the same thing?" "No." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't decode, something between curiosity and old caution. And then she looked back at her tea. "What are you trying to say that you can't get on paper?" "That's not your problem to solve." Her jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Something more controlled than anger. "I know that," she said. "I was making conversation." The table was quiet for 3 seconds that lasted considerably longer. Marcus looked between them with the studied neutrality of someone who'd registered that something was in the room and was choosing not to name it. Ethan's mother clicked her pen. Kian. The morning schedule pulled everyone in different directions. Dress fittings, a call with the venue, Ethan's 2 aunts requiring attention, and Jaemin was grateful for the separation the way you're grateful for a cold shower when you can't think straight. He took a car into the city at 10 and spent 2 hours in a meeting in Yowido that had nothing to do with the wedding and everything to do with the other version of his life. A man named Director Cho, one of 3 partners in a network Jaemin had been managing for 6 years, had been making decisions without consultation. Small ones at first, then larger ones. The kind of drift that, in Jaemin's world, meant one of 2 things. Either the man was getting sloppy or he was getting ambitious. Jaemin sat across from him in a private room above a restaurant that had been closed to the public for the afternoon and listened to Cho talk for 11 minutes before cutting him off. "You moved money through the Suwon account," Jaemin said. Cho stopped. 3 weeks ago, 42 million. You rerouted it through a holding company I don't have a position in. Jaemin's voice was even. It was always even when it mattered most. Why? Cho said, "It was a timing issue. The window was—" "I didn't ask about the window." Silence. "I asked why." Cho's hands were on the table. He was 53 years old and had been in this business longer than Jaemin, and he was currently doing what everyone eventually did in rooms like this one, reassessing whether the calculation he'd made had been worth it. "There was an opportunity," Cho said carefully. "I thought you'd want to move on it. You were occupied." "I'm always occupied," Jaemin said. "That is never a reason." The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Jaemin drove back to Seongbok with his hands loose on the wheel and his mind doing the specific cold arithmetic it did when something required a response that wasn't immediate but would need to be complete. He'd deal with Cho after the wedding. He'd deal with everything after the wedding. Right now, there was a rehearsal dinner in 4 days and a woman in his best friend's house who could unravel 12 years of careful distance just by sitting in a corner seat. That afternoon, Ethan pulled him aside. They were in Ethan's study, books on 2 walls, a desk that was always messy, a window overlooking the side garden. It was the room Jaemin associated most specifically with Ethan because it was the only space in the house that looked genuinely lived in rather than arranged for living. Ethan closed the door and didn't sit down. "How are you doing?" Ethan said. Not a question, a check. "Fine." "Don't do that." Ethan leaned against the desk. He was 42, thick across the shoulders, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and when he was being serious, he had a particular stillness that he'd learned from a long time of being the person in the room who had to hold things together. "You looked at her 6 times at breakfast." "I wasn't counting." "I was." Ethan crossed his arms. "Talk to me." Jaemin looked at the bookshelf. Ethan had a collection of Korean poetry that he'd been adding to since he was 19 and had never read any of. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say something real, for once." Ethan's voice stayed level, but there was an edge in it, old and familiar, the edge that only came out when Ethan was genuinely worried and refusing to show it as worry. "She's my sister, Jaemin. She spent 2 years after she left here putting herself back together. 2 years. And then she built something good. I watched her do it. I'm not interested in watching her take that apart again. I'm not asking her to." "You don't have to ask. You just have to be in the same room and do that thing you do where you look at people like you're solving them. And she—" Ethan stopped, pressed his fingers to the edge of the desk. "She's not over it." Jaemin turned to look at him. "I'm not saying that to manipulate you," Ethan said. "I'm saying it so you understand what's in the room. She's built a good life. She has her work, her apartment, her people. She came back here for me and Jisoo, and she deserves a week that doesn't cost her anything. I know that. Do you?" "Ethan." Jaemin held his gaze. "I'm not going to do anything." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he exhaled and said, "Good." And then quieter, almost not quite a question. "Do you still?" "Don't." Ethan nodded. He'd learned 20 years ago where Jaemin's lines were. He didn't push past them. "Okay," he said. "Rehearsal dinner Thursday. Don't make the speech about yourself." "I know how to give a speech." "I know, but I'm telling you anyway." Ethan uncrossed his arms and moved toward the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame. "She runs in the mornings. If you knew that already, I'm staying out of it. If you didn't, now you know to give her the east path." He left. Jamin stood in the study for a while and looked at the books Ethan never read. Tuesday evening brought rain, and with it the house contracted. Everyone pulled inward, filling the common spaces, the kind of enforced proximity that either brought people together or made every tension in the room sharper and more exposed. Jamin was in the sitting room with a book he wasn't reading when Marcus came in with a bottle of wine and the casual authority of a man who didn't notice that some rooms weren't his to fill. "Anyone?" Marcus held up the bottle toward the room generally. Jisu's father said yes. Ethan's cousin appeared from somewhere. And then Amara came down the stairs in a change of clothes, dark jeans, a loose sweater, hair loose, and said yes without looking at who was asking. They sat. Wine was poured. Ethan's cousin, whose name was Dae-woo and who was more interesting when he wasn't on his phone, started a conversation about the places people had traveled since they'd last all been together, which was 3 years ago for Ethan's 40th birthday dinner. Marcus had been to Nairobi, Lagos, Lisbon. Jisu's father had done a walking trip in Japan. Amara had spent 2 weeks in Morocco last spring. "What brought you to Morocco?" Marcus asked. "I needed to be somewhere that didn't feel familiar," she said. "I was finishing a project. I wanted noise that wasn't in my language." "Did it work?" "Mostly." She held her wine glass with one hand, stem between 2 fingers. "You stop hearing the words after a while. It becomes just sound. That's useful sometimes." Jamin was watching her from the armchair by the window. He knew he was doing it. He also knew Ethan had gone to bed an hour ago, which meant there was no one in the room who would notice and call him on it, except possibly Marcus, who seemed to notice most things without appearing to. "What was the project?" Dae-woo asked. "A consulting restructure. A company in the middle of a leadership crisis." Amara's mouth turned slightly, not quite a smile. People in power who'd held it for so long they'd stopped knowing what they were actually in charge of. They kept making decisions about the organization's future without understanding what the organization currently was. Jamin set his book down. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her wine. "How do you fix that?" Marcus asked. "You make them listen to the people they stopped listening to," she said, "which is harder than it sounds. Because by the time a company's in that kind of crisis, the people at the top have usually spent years building systems that make sure they don't have to hear anything uncomfortable." She finally glanced up, and her eyes found Jamin's with a precision that was not accidental and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds before she looked back at Marcus. "So you rebuild the feedback loops, make the discomfort unavoidable, and hope they're ready for it." The room moved on. Jamin sat with his unread book and the precise, unpleasant feeling of having understood every word of what she'd just said and knowing she'd meant him to. Bullpan. At 10:30, the group broke up. Dae-woo went to call his wife. Jisu's father said goodnight. Marcus offered Amara the last of the wine. She declined, and then Marcus drifted toward the hallway and left the 2 of them in the sitting room alone for the first time since the morning in the garden. Amara didn't move immediately. She sat with her empty glass and looked at the rain on the window. Jamin didn't move either. "The Morocco thing," he said. She turned her head slightly. "Was that directed at me?" "Does it matter?" "I'm asking." She looked at him fully then, and he saw it. The tiredness she was carrying beneath the composure. The specific tiredness of someone who'd been maintaining a careful distance all day and was running lower on the energy it cost. "You always want to know the exact thing," she said, "whether something was directed at you, whether something meant something. You collect the information and you do nothing with it. That's not accurate. Isn't it?" She stood up, set her glass on the side table. 12 years ago I told you something direct and clear, and you heard it and filed it away and gave me nothing. That's what you do." She wasn't raising her voice. It was almost worse than if she had. "You process and you protect, and you make every decision completely alone, and then you're surprised when the people around you feel invisible. I wasn't surprised, he said. Something shifted in her face. I knew exactly what I was doing, he said. I knew what it would cost. He paused. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to understand that it wasn't nothing. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the rain hit the glass steadily. That's not enough, she said. 12 years later, knowing it wasn't nothing is... She stopped, pressed her lips together. It's not enough. I know. Then why are you saying it? Because you should know it, even if it doesn't change anything. She picked up her glass, seemed to realize it was empty, and set it back down. Then she looked at him with something exhausted and unguarded and said, I need you to let me get through this week, Jae-min. That's all I need from you. Can you do that? He should have said yes. The word was right there, clean and simple in what the situation required. The version of him that had built 12 years of careful control should have said yes without hesitation. He said, I'll try. It was the most honest thing he'd told her yet, and it wasn't what she wanted, and she knew the difference. She left the room without another word. He sat in the empty sitting room with the rain on the glass and the unread book on the arm of the chair, and thought about Ethan's voice that afternoon. She's not over it, and thought about the way her eyes had found his across the room during the conversation about Morocco, and thought about the specific shape of the next 4 days and what they were going to ask of him. Then his phone lit up. A message from Park Soo-yeon marked urgent. Director Cho had made another move, bigger than the last one, and this time he hadn't tried to hide it. Jae-min stared at the screen. 2 problems, 2 worlds, and for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't sure which one he was more afraid of getting wrong. He didn't sleep. He sat at the small desk in the guest room with his laptop open and his phone face up, and worked through the Cho situation the way he worked through every crisis, methodically, without panic, following the thread of each decision backward until he found the point where the deviation had begun. Park Soo-yeon had sent 3 documents by midnight. By 1 in the morning, he had a complete picture, and it was worse than the incomplete one. Cho hadn't been acting alone. That was the part that took him 20 minutes to fully accept, because it required him to revise a set of assumptions he'd held for 6 years about who was trustworthy and who wasn't. And Jae-min didn't revise assumptions easily. He'd built his networks on the basis of those assumptions. He'd made decisions, significant ones, the kind with long tails, based on a model of his organization that had apparently been compromised for at least 14 months. Cho had a partner, a man named Baek Sung-jin, who operated through 3 different corporate shells in Pangyo and who Jae-min had vetted 4 years ago and cleared, which meant either his vetting had been wrong or Baek had changed his position after the fact. Neither option was comfortable. Both required response. He sent 4 messages, received 3 replies before 2 a.m., made 2 calls that he kept short and unspecific, because even secured lines had limits and the walls of a house could carry sound in ways that weren't always predictable. By the time he closed the laptop, the rain had stopped and the garden outside was silent, and he had a plan that would need to be executed the week after the wedding and would cost him something he hadn't yet fully calculated. He lay on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Amara had said. I need you to let me get through this week. He thought about the way she'd said it. Not pleading, not angry. The specific tone of someone who has already done the work of surviving something and just needs the conditions to hold for a few more days. He thought about the word try and how it had landed on her face when he'd said it. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. Wednesday arrived gray and close, the sky sitting low over the estate, the air carrying the particular heavy stillness that sometimes followed rain. Jae-min came down at 7 to find Ethan already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with coffee and his phone, and the expression he got when something on the schedule had broken. What? Jae-min said. The florist called. The arrangements for the rehearsal dinner have a problem. Some of the imported flowers didn't survive the shipment. They need someone to go to a second supplier in Gapyeong to pick up replacements. Ethan set his phone down. I'd go myself, but Jisoo's parents want to do a family lunch today, and I can't skip it. Her father's been quiet in a way that worries me. Send one of the staff. I did. Mrs. Huang can't handle it. The supplier is someone her family has a history with, and she shut that down immediately. Ethan refilled his coffee. I was going to ask Daewoo, but he left this morning. Something with his job. Jamin waited. Ethan looked at him with the expression of a man who knew exactly what he was about to say and had already accepted that it was going to be a problem. I need 2 people to go. The order's large and the supplier wants a decision made in person on the substitutions. Amara knows flowers, so she helped plan my mother's anniversary party 3 years ago and spent a week researching them. She already said she'd go. He paused. I need you to go with her. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan? I know. You know what you're asking. I'm asking you to drive 2 hours and pick up flowers. That's what I'm asking. Ethan held his gaze steadily. Whatever else is in the room between you two, that's not what I'm asking. I need the flowers. The wedding is in 4 days. You're the only other person here who can handle whatever comes up. Jamin looked at the window above the sink. The garden outside was silver and still. What time? He said. Nights. She was waiting by the car at 9. She had a tote bag over one shoulder and a coffee thermos in one hand, and she was wearing her glasses, the ones slightly too large for her face. And when she saw him come down the front steps, she looked at him with an expression that said she knew exactly how this had been arranged and had made peace with it and was going to be professional about it. Ethan tell you it was my idea? She asked. No. Good, because it wasn't. She opened the passenger door. I'll navigate. He drove. She navigated. The first 40 minutes were almost entirely silent, which suited him and which he suspected suited her also, though for different reasons. The city gave way to the outer districts and then to the cleaner lines of the highway north, the landscape opening up, the sky still low but brighter now in a way that suggested it might clear by afternoon. She had a playlist running quietly through the car speakers. Not music he knew, something with a slow rhythm and no lyrics. And at some point, around the 40-minute mark, she stopped looking at her phone and started looking at the road. Tell me about Kangstone, she said. He glanced at her. We have 2 hours, she said. I can either ask you questions or we can sit in silence, and the silence is starting to feel like a third passenger. What do you want to know about Kangstone? What it actually is, not the public version. Ethan tells me the structure, but he never tells me what you actually built it for. She held the thermos with both hands. He says it's different from what you thought it would be. Ethan talks too much. Only to me, and only about things he's worried about. She looked at him sideways. So what is it? He thought about how to answer that honestly without telling her things he couldn't tell her. It started as a way to give the other side of what I do a legitimate structure, he said. A face. Something that could operate in daylight. He paused. It became more than that. The legitimate side got large enough that it started to matter on its own. Now I spend more time on Kangstone than on the other work. Is that intentional? It became intentional. She was quiet for a moment. You're trying to get out. He didn't answer. You don't have to confirm it. I'm just saying I can hear it. She looked back at the road. Ethan's worried you don't know what you'd be without it. Ethan should worry about his own wedding. He's a multitasker. She almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself. Are you? Am I what? Trying to get out? The highway curved north and the landscape on either side went greener. He kept his eyes on the road and thought about Cho and Bake and the 14 months of drift and the cost of what needed to happen next week. And he thought about the version of himself he'd been trying to build for the last 3 years. Quieter, less exposed, less dependent on fear as a management tool. Yes, he said. It was the first time he'd said it to anyone who wasn't already inside that plan. She absorbed it without theatrics. How long? I'll know when it's finished. She nodded, once. Then she said, that must be exhausting, trying to dismantle something you built with your own hands. Everything worth changing is exhausting. That's almost philosophical. Don't read into it. She did smile then, briefly, and turned to look out the passenger window. And for a moment the car was quiet, in a way that was different from the earlier silence, less armored, less like a standoff. That The supplier's location was a flower farm and wholesale depot at the edge of a small town south of Gapyeong, reached by a county road that the navigation system described with more confidence than it deserved. They arrived at 10:45 to find a sprawling greenhouse complex, the smell of cut flowers hitting them even before they were fully out of the car. Something green and dense and almost overwhelming. The supplier was a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Bake. No relation to the Bake, currently rearranging Jae-min's professional life, which was the kind of coincidence that a worse day would have made him find funny. She was matter-of-fact and moved quickly and had opinions about the substitution flowers that she expressed without waiting to be asked. The original order had included Dutch tulips and specific orchids. The replacements she proposed were a Korean variety of ranunculus and a white dahlia that she insisted photographed better under artificial light anyway. Amar asked questions Jae-min would never have thought to ask. About the stem length, the water absorption rate, how the flowers would hold over 4 days, whether the ranunculus were early or late in their season. Mrs. Bake answered all of them with the particular respect of an expert recognizing someone who had actually done their research. Jae-min stood slightly behind Amara and watched her work and felt something move through him that he didn't immediately name. It took him a moment to identify it. Pride. An old and poorly stored feeling. Something he'd buried so thoroughly he almost didn't recognize it when it surfaced. He looked away. The order was confirmed and the flowers were being prepared for transport, which Mrs. Beck informed them would take approximately 90 minutes because her assistant had called in sick and she was doing the boxing herself and she wasn't going to rush it. Amara thanked her with a grace that meant it. Jae-min wrote the bank transfer on his phone, and then they were loose in a small town with 90 minutes to fill. There was one cafe on the main street. They went to it. What? The cafe was the kind of place that existed in small Korean towns and almost nowhere else. Slightly too warm, with laminated menus and a television in the corner playing a variety program with the volume too low to hear. The woman behind the counter was approximately 16 and deeply uninterested in them. They sat at a corner table with coffee and a plate of bread. Neither of them had intended to order and came with it anyway. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Not the armored silence of the car, just the particular quiet of two people who had used up their careful language and were now sitting with whatever was underneath. Then Amara said, "I heard you. Last night." He went still. "After I went upstairs, I came back down because I forgot my phone." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You and Ethan weren't in the study, but the door wasn't fully closed, and I heard—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I heard him ask you if you still had feelings for me." Jae-min said nothing. "And I heard you say don't." She looked at him. "Which isn't a no." He looked at the table. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "I just need you to understand that I've spent 12 years operating on the assumption that what you said to me in that office was the full truth. That I simply wasn't—" She paused. "Something you wanted. That the rejection was complete, because that's what you gave me, a complete rejection. No explanation, no door left open, nothing." Amara. "Let me finish." She wasn't angry. That was the thing that made it harder than anger would have been. She was precise and controlled and clearly had been thinking about this since last night and possibly for longer. "I built my entire recovery around that assumption. I told myself the story that I had been wrong about what I felt, or wrong about what I saw in you, or just simply wrong to have said anything at all. I made that the foundation of how I moved forward." She set the cup down carefully. "And if that story isn't accurate, then I need to know. Not because it changes anything practical. Not because I'm asking you to do anything, just because I've been carrying incorrect information for 12 years, and I'm tired." The cafe hummed around them. The television in the corner switched to a weather segment. He looked at her face, the steadiness of it, the specific cost that steadiness was taking. "It wasn't a complete rejection," he said. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "I rejected you because I was afraid," he said. "Not because I didn't want you, because I did. And my world at that point was—it was at its most dangerous. I had enemies I hadn't fully accounted for. I had operations that were not stable. And you were Ethan's sister, and I had already... He stopped. His jaw was tight. I had already seen what happened to people who got close to me. A man who worked with me lost his wife because someone wanted to send a message. She was 29 years old. He said it flatly, without decoration. I wasn't going to put you in that position. I wasn't going to tell you the truth because the truth would have given you a reason to stay, and you needed to go. She opened her eyes. That's why, he said. That's all of it. I let you think you were wrong about what you felt because it was the cleanest way to make you leave. And I've known for 12 years that it was a cowardly way to do it. I'm not asking you to receive that as sufficient. I'm just telling you the truth finally, because you asked for it and because you deserve it. The cafe was quiet. She looked at him with an expression that was not forgiveness and not fury, but something more complicated than either. The specific face of someone who has just had a structure they built, carefully replaced with a different structure, and is trying to assess what still stands. You should have told me, she said. I was an adult. I could have made my own decision. I know. You took that from me. I know. She looked down at the table. Her thumb moved once against the side of the coffee cup. What was her name? The woman who was killed. He hadn't expected that question. Sun Yeon-hee, he said. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Not acceptance, just receipt. Okay. And then the door of the cafe opened and Marcus Hale walked in. Sub. It took Jae-min 3 full seconds to process what he was seeing because it made no sense. Marcus was supposed to be at the estate. There was a family lunch. The schedule had been clear. And in those 3 seconds, Marcus had already seen them, both of them, at the corner table with the remains of a conversation that must have been visible on both their faces, and his expression went through something briefly before it settled into the easy warmth it usually wore. Small world, Marcus said. Amara looked up. Marcus. Something reset behind her eyes. The thing they'd been inside was sealed shut in under a second, which told Jae-min she'd had practice with exactly this kind of interruption. What are you doing here? Ethan sent me, said you'd need an extra pair of hands for the flower order. Marcus looked at Jae-min. Apparently the boxes are heavy. Jae-min looked at him for a moment and then looked at the window. Ethan had sent him, which meant Ethan had decided 2 hours alone in a car was enough and had sent reinforcement. He didn't know whether to be grateful or furious, and he landed somewhere between the two that felt like neither. Sit down, Amara said to Marcus. We have 40 minutes. Marcus sat. He ordered coffee. He was easy and warm and took up exactly as much space as the situation required. And within 6 minutes, he had Amara talking about the ranunculus substitution in a way that was almost natural, almost like the previous conversation had not happened, almost like the cafe table was not still carrying the weight of 12 years of finely spoken truth. Almost. Jae-min sat across from both of them and looked at his cold coffee and understood with bleak precision what Marcus's arrival had just done. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but completely. It had taken the most unguarded moment Amar had offered him in 12 years and sealed it off before it could become anything. He looked at her face. She was talking to Marcus. Her voice was normal. Her hands were still. But she hadn't looked at Jae-min once since Marcus sat down, and the specific care of that avoidance told him everything about how much that conversation had cost her, and how hard she was working now to keep the cost from showing. The drive back was different. Marcus rode in the back with the window cracked. Amara navigated from the front seat again, same as before, but the playlist wasn't running this time, and the silence had re-armored itself into something closer to the beginning of the morning than the middle of it. Jae-min drove and kept his eyes on the road and let the distance collapse kilometer by kilometer. They were 40 minutes from the estate when his phone rang through the car speakers. He declined it. Unknown prefix. It rang again 30 seconds later. Amara looked at him. He declined again. The third call came with a text from Soo-yeon that appeared on the dash screen before he could stop it. Urgent. Cho is talking. Need your decision before 6. Marcus, in the back seat, said nothing, but he'd seen it. Jae-min knew he'd seen it because the silence from the back seat changed quality. Amara looked at the dash screen and then at Jae-min, and her expression was careful and flat, in the way expressions go flat when someone has just filed a piece of information away for later review. He turned the display off. "Business," he said. "Okay," she said. She looked back at the road. The remaining 40 minutes passed without conversation. They reached the estate at 2:15 and unloaded the flowers with the help of 2 staff members, Marcus directing the placement of the boxes with the same easy competence he brought to everything. Amara spoke to Mrs. Huang about storage temperatures. Jamin carried the heaviest boxes and said nothing. When the unloading was done, he went straight to the east staircase and up to his room and called Su Yeon. "Tell me," he said. "Cho is cooperating with Lee Tae-sung," she said. Lee Tae-sung was a name that changed the weight of everything. A former associate who had separated from Jae-min's network 2 years ago in an arrangement that was supposed to be clean and had apparently not been. "They've been building a parallel structure inside 2 of your Incheon holdings. If they move before you do, you lose the Incheon positions and everything downstream." "How long have they been building it?" A pause. 14 months. 14 months. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor and did the arithmetic. 14 months ago, he had been in the middle of the most significant legitimate expansion Kangstone had ever undertaken. He had been distracted. He had trusted the structures he'd built and not watched them closely enough. "Who else knows?" he said. "Inside your circle?" "I'm not certain. That's the problem." He was quiet for a moment. The wedding was in 3 days. Ethan's wedding. The 1 week of this year that was supposed to be insulated from everything else. "I need names," he said. "Everyone Cho has spoken to in the last 14 months. Pull every record. I don't care what it costs." "There's something else," Soo-yeon said, and the quality of her voice changed. She was careful, which meant she was about to say something he wasn't going to want to hear. "Lee Tae-sung made a request through an intermediary last week. He wants a meeting." "No." He specified the location. He said he'd only meet in Seongbuk. A pause that lasted exactly the right length of time to be deliberate. "He knows where you are." Jaemin stood up. Lee Tae-sung knew about the wedding, knew about the estate, knew that Jae-min was currently in a house full of people who had nothing to do with his world and everything to do with what Lee could use against him if he chose to apply pressure in the right direction. He crossed to the window. The garden below was quiet in the afternoon light, the flowers from the morning's trip already in the cool storage of the estate's kitchen. Somewhere below him, Amara was talking to someone. He could hear her voice distantly through the floor, not the words, just the cadence. Even, composed, professional. He had brought his world here. He had told himself for 12 years that he kept his 2 lives separate, that the people he loved were insulated from the costs of what he was, that the structure of his control was sufficient to protect the things he wasn't willing to lose. Lee Tae-sung had just proven every part of that wrong. And in 3 days, in this house, Ethan Cross was going to marry the woman he loved, surrounded by the people he trusted most in the world, including the sister he'd spent 20 years protecting, and the best friend he'd spent 20 years believing was someone worth protecting in return. Jaemin stood at the window with the phone in his hand and the weight of 14 months of blind trust settling into his chest like something that had been falling for a long time and had finally hit the floor. He had one move. It was going to cost him something he couldn't get back. He dialed. "Set up the meeting," he said. The meeting was set for 11 that night. Not at the estate. Jaemin wasn't going to bring Lee Tae-sung through those gates, wasn't going to let that name get any closer to this house than it already had. He arranged it at a restaurant in Gapyeong that he knew, a private room in the back that he'd used twice before for exactly this kind of conversation. He told Soo-yeon to confirm the location and told her nothing else. Then he sat on the edge of the bed for 4 minutes and did something he almost never did. He thought about what he was afraid of. Not Lee, not Cho, not the Incheon positions or the 14 months of exposure. He was afraid of what happened if this week cracked open. If the wall between his 2 lives came down in this specific house, in these specific 4 days, with these specific people inside it. Ethan's wedding, Ethan's mother, Jisoo's parents with their careful posture and their 3 years of cautious trust. Marcus in the back seat reading a dashboard message that wasn't meant for him. And Amara. Amara, who had just given him the most unguarded thing she'd offered in 12 years, and who deserved, at minimum, a week that didn't cost her anything. He'd told Ethan he wasn't going to do anything. He told himself the same. Lee Tae-sung had just made both promises significantly harder to keep. He changed his shirt, put on a jacket, and went downstairs to dinner as if none of it was happening. Set. Dinner was quieter than the previous nights. Jisoo's parents were subdued. Something had shifted at the family lunch, though Ethan's face gave nothing away about what. And Ethan's mother was compensating by talking more than usual, filling the table's silences with wedding logistics and memories that nobody had asked for and everyone appreciated anyway. Jisoo ate with her eyes down, which meant she was thinking hard about something and not ready to address it. Marcus was his usual steady warmth. Daewoo was still gone. Amara sat 2 seats from Jaemin and spoke when spoken to and said nothing directly to him. He watched her out of the edges of his vision the way he'd taught himself to watch rooms. Not staring, just registering. She was tired. More tired than last night, which had already been running close to the limit of what composure could hold. The glasses were on again, and there was a small tension in her jaw that she was probably not aware of, the kind that came from holding a face still for too long. He looked at his food. Ethan caught his eye once across the table. Just once. His expression was unreadable, which for Ethan meant he was reading everything. At 8:30, Jaemin excused himself and went upstairs to make the calls he needed to make before 11. He had too many trusted with this kind of thing, not because they were the most capable, but because they were the most discreet, which in his experience was rarer and more valuable. He reached them both by 9. They would be at the restaurant by 10:30. They weren't there as threat or backup. They were there because walking into a room with Lee Tae-sung alone, in the current situation, would be a form of stupidity he couldn't afford. At 9:45, he was putting his phone in his jacket pocket when someone knocked on the guest room door. He opened it. Amara. She was still in the clothes from dinner, and she was holding a folded piece of paper, and for one specific second before she spoke, he thought something had happened. Her expression was that tight. And then she said, "Ethan told me what you did at the florist, that you paid for the full order without telling him. He found out from Mrs. Bake when she called to confirm." He said nothing. "He wanted me to tell you that you didn't need to do that." He could have texted. He thought it would be better coming from me. She looked at him. "I don't know what that means about his current mental state." She held out the paper. "He also wanted you to have this. It's the speech he wrote for you. He said he knows you have 3 versions, and they're all wrong, and this is a version 4 to consider." Jaemin took the paper. He didn't open it. She was about to turn back toward the hall when she looked at his jacket. The jacket was the kind he wore when he was working. Heavier, inner pocket. The cut that allowed for certain things without making them visible. She'd never seen him in it before today. But she looked at it once with the specific focus of a woman who was smart and who had grown up with a brother who had told her gradually, "Enough." "You're going somewhere," she said. "Business. Tonight." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is it the thing from the car? The message?" "Amara." "I'm not asking details. I'm asking if you're okay." The question landed differently than he expected it to. Not worried exactly. More like a witness. Someone who was standing outside a situation and seeing it clearly and offering that clarity without asking for anything in return. "It's manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "I'm not okay. But it's manageable." She nodded once, the way she had in the cafe when he'd said he was trying to get out. Receipt, not response. "Come back in one piece," she said, and walked back down the hall. He stood in the doorway and watched her go, and then closed the door and put Ethan's speech in his jacket pocket and picked up his keys. Lee Tae-sung was already in the private room when Jae-min arrived. That was the first thing. He was already there, seated, unhurried, with a glass of water and the posture of a man who had decided how the room was going to go before anyone else entered it. He was 55, lean, with the kind of stillness that came not from discipline but from the specific calm of a man who had decided he was no longer afraid of consequences. He'd built his career first alongside Jae-min and then independently, and the 2 years since their separation had apparently treated him well enough that he felt comfortable arranging a meeting and specifying the location. Jamin sat down across from him. His 2 men were outside the door. Lee had 1 man visible in the corner, and at least one more that Jamin made in the first 30 seconds from the way the room's geometry was wrong. "You look well," Lee said. "Don't," Jamin said. Lee paused. Then he almost smiled. "Straight to it, then. You've been building inside my Inchin positions for 14 months. You're using Cho as the interface and Baek Sung Jin as the structure. You called this meeting, which means you want something. Say what it is." Lee looked at him with the considering expression of someone who had expected the level of preparation and wasn't surprised, but was reassessing the speed of it. "You're good," he said. "You've always been good." That was never the question. "What's the question?" "The question is whether you're going to be good enough to hold what you have while also doing what I know you're trying to do." He picked up his water glass. "You're unwinding. I've watched you do it for 2 years. The Kangstone expansion, the legitimization, the quiet movement of assets to positions that don't require your particular kind of management." He set the glass down. "You want out?" Jamin said nothing. "I'm not criticizing it," Lee said. "It's rational. You've built what you built. You're 41. The risk-reward has shifted." He spread his hand slightly. "I'm offering you an exit." "You're offering me an exit from something you've been destroying from the inside for 14 months. I've been building leverage. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm sitting." Lee's expression didn't change, but his hands came off the table and into his lap, which meant he was recalibrating. "I want the Inchin positions," he said, "the 2 northern holdings and the transport network. I want them transferred cleanly, at assessed value, within 60 days. In exchange, I stop the current operation. Everything Cho has built inside your structure gets rolled back. Beck disappears. You walk out of the network completely. The exit you've been planning for 2 years compressed into 60 days instead of however long you had it scheduled." He paused. "And nobody outside this room needs to know how it was structured." Jamin looked at him. "The Inchin positions are worth 400 million, Jamin said. "Yes. At assessed value, they're worth closer to 600. That's the cost of a clean exit on an accelerated timeline." The room was very quiet. Outside, faintly, he could hear the sound of the highway. He thought about what the Incheon positions actually were. Not just the financial value, but the structural role they played in the network, the leverage they provided, the downstream operations that ran through them. Giving them up would hurt. Giving them up in 60 days would hurt significantly more. It would leave certain relationships exposed during the transition, and certain operations temporarily unmanaged, and certain men who currently worked inside his network needing to be reabsorbed or released in a time frame that didn't allow for the care those conversations deserved. But Lee knew that. Lee had built the place specifically to make the accelerated timeline the most painful part. "If I say no," Jamin said, "you know what happens if you say no." "Tell me anyway." Lee looked at him without expression. "The Incheon operation continues. Cho files a disclosure with people who would find it very useful. The Kangstone expansion gets complicated in ways that take years to untangle, and I have a conversation with certain parties about your current location, which you've been kind enough to maintain publicly enough that it wasn't difficult to find." He paused. "You're at Ethan Cross's estate in Seongbuk. He's getting married Saturday. His sister flew in from New York. The guest list is not small." The room temperature didn't change. Jamin's breathing didn't change. His hands on the table didn't move. But something behind his eyes went very cold, and Lee, who had known him for 16 years, saw it and had the sense to stop talking. "You mentioned my friend's family," Jamin said. "I mentioned a location." "You mentioned a wedding." His voice was completely level. This was the register it reached when the temperature behind his eyes went past a certain point. Not louder, not harder, but emptied of every hesitation. "Say what you mean. Don't dress it in geography." Lee held his gaze. "I mean that you have things to lose that aren't financial, that accelerate certain calculations." Jamin sat very still for 10 seconds. He thought about Ethan's face across the dinner table, Jisoo's careful posture, Ethan's mother and the anniversary party flowers, and the phone calls from Dae John. He thought about Marcus in the back seat, and the dashboard message, and the gap between his two lives that was no longer a gap, that Lee had just walked through casually in a restaurant outside Gapyeong, with a glass of water and a real estate proposal. He thought about Amara in the hallway 40 minutes ago. Come back in one piece. I'll take the meeting under advisement, he said. Lee blinked. That's not... I'll take it under advisement, Jae-min said again, the same register, same temperature. You'll have my answer in 24 hours. The timeline is mine now. He stood up. You made a play. I heard it. The answer is coming in 24 hours, and it will be complete, and you will accept it, or you will find that compressed timelines work in more than one direction. He looked at Lee directly, without performance, without the particular energy he used in rooms where fear was a tool. Just the direct communication of a man who had decided exactly what was happening. Don't contact the estate. Don't reference anyone in that house again. If I find out you've gone past tonight's conversation in any direction, the Incheon positions are the least of your problems. Lee sat very still. 24 hours, Jae-min said, and walked out. Tet. He drove back to Seongbuk with both hands on the wheel and his mind doing the arithmetic that it did in extremis. Cold, sequential, without room for feeling until the calculation was complete. The Incheon positions, the 60-day timeline, the cost of acceptance against the cost of refusal. The exposure that Lee had created by knowing about the estate, which meant the exposure didn't end with the meeting. It existed as a variable in the air until the whole situation was resolved. He could resolve it without accepting the terms. It would take 7 days and resources he'd need to pull from other positions, and it would close off certain options he'd planned to use during the legitimate exit. It would cost him more than the deal Lee had offered, but it would cost Lee more too, and it would leave Jae-min in control of the timeline rather than Lee. That was the option. He knew it by the time he turned off the highway. He also knew that executing it would require him to be completely in the other version of himself for the next 72 hours. The version that Amara had never fully seen. The version that made the decisions that couldn't be cleaned up. The version that he was trying to build his way out of. The version that had, 14 months ago, trusted too much and watched too little, and created the conditions for Lee Tae-sung to walk into a restaurant and say your friend's family's wedding without flinching. He parked at the estate at midnight. The house was dark except for 2 windows, one on the 3rd floor that was his room and that he'd left the lamp on in, and one on the 2nd floor east corner that he recognized as Amara's. He sat in the car for a moment. The light in her window was steady, not the moving around quality of someone still up and active, the lamp quality, like she'd fallen asleep with it on. He got out of the car. He went inside and up the stairs, and when he reached the 2nd floor, he slowed without deciding to, and he stood in the corridor outside Amar's door for approximately 4 seconds before he walked onto the 3rd floor, and into his own room, and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. He took the speech out of his jacket pocket, Ethan's handwriting folded twice. He opened it. Ethan had written 6 sentences. The first 5 were about friendship, and about 20 years, and about what it looked like to watch your best friend become the man you knew he could be. The 6th sentence said, the best thing Jae-min ever did was love this family, and the second best thing he'll ever do is figure out what he's allowed to love next. That part is coming. I've seen the signs. Jae-min read the 6th sentence 3 times. Then he folded the paper and held it in both hands and sat with the weight of the night. Lee's water glass, the highway sound, 24 hours, Cho and Bake, and 14 months, the Incheon positions, the accelerated exit, the cost of every choice and the cost of every choice he hadn't made yet, and something inside his chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time began, slowly and without his permission, to loosen. Thursday morning came in sharp and clear, the sky finally empty of the week's weather, the estate grounds lit with the particular precision of autumn sun that showed everything in high contrast. Jae-min came down at 7 to find Ethan in the kitchen already, same as yesterday, coffee and phone, and a face that had done a full night's processing of something. Before Ethan could speak, Jae-min said, "There's a problem." Ethan set down his coffee. "My world," Jae-min said. "Not yours, not this house, mine. But it's been brought close enough that I need to tell you." He told him. Not everything. Enough Cho, Lee, the Incheon positions, the meeting last night, the reference to the estate. He used the language he used with Ethan for this kind of conversation, which was stripped of detail and heavy on structure, and Ethan listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without the face changes that most people made when they were receiving difficult information. When Jae-min finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it handled?" "It will be, in 24 hours. And my family is safe right now." "Yes, he won't move on the estate. It would remove his leverage. As long as he thinks I'm considering his terms, no one here is at risk." Ethan picked up his coffee. His hands were steady. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing. I'm telling you because you needed to know, not because I need help." "Okay." Ethan looked at him. "What's the 24-hour plan?" "I'm not going to tell you that part." "Right." Ethan nodded slowly. "Okay." He was quiet again, and then he said, with a carefulness that meant he'd been holding this since at least last night, "Marcus told me about the message on the dashboard, in the car." Jaemin said nothing. "He didn't make it a thing. He just mentioned it. He wasn't gossiping. He was checking that you were okay." Ethan set the cup down. "He told me Amara didn't react, that she saw it and let it go." He looked at Jaemin directly. "She's been protecting you all week. You know that, right? Every time something comes close to the surface, she's the one who seals it. She's been managing the distance so you don't have to." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," Jaemin said. "She shouldn't have to do that. That's not her job." "I know." Ethan held his gaze for a long moment. "My wedding is in 2 days. Handle what you need to handle. But after the wedding," he stopped, started again. "After the wedding, whatever this is between you two, don't let it go another 12 years. That's all I'm saying. I'm done watching two people I love spend their lives managing a distance neither of them actually wants." Outside, the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall and was coming through the kitchen window, warm and direct, and somewhere on the estate grounds Jae-min could hear, distantly, footsteps on gravel. The east path. Amara's morning run. He stood in the kitchen with Ethan's 6th sentence still folded in his jacket pocket from last night, and the 24 hours ahead of him, and the 2 days until the wedding, and the weight of every calculation he'd ever made in his life pressing against the inside of his chest. And then Marcus Hale walked through the kitchen door with wet shoes and a jacket, still damp from the garden air, and stopped when he saw both of them standing there in the particular stillness of a conversation that had just finished. Marcus looked at Jaemin, then at Ethan, then back at Jaemin. "Am I interrupting?" he said. "No," Ethan said. "Get coffee." Marcus moved to the sideboard. Jaemin turned toward the door, and then Marcus said, without looking up from the coffee, "She asked about you this morning, on the path." He poured, still not looking up. "I was coming back in. She was heading out. She asked if you'd come home last night." The door was 2 feet away. Jaemin stopped. "I told her your car was in the drive," Marcus said. He turned then, cup in hand, and looked at Jaemin with a directness that was the first unguarded thing he'd shown all week. "Whatever's between you two. And I'm not asking. I'm not involved. Don't waste it. I've watched her for 4 days, and she is not a woman who asks questions she doesn't already know the answer to." He took a drink of his coffee. "That's all I've got." Jaemin looked at him for a moment. Then he walked out of the kitchen, out through the side door, and onto the gravel path heading east. The sun was low and direct, and the path curved around the garden wall, and he could see her 30 meters ahead, dark tights, gray jacket, earbuds in, pace steady. He walked fast enough to close the distance without running, and when he was 10 meters back, she heard the gravel and turned. She pulled one earbud out. They were alone on the path. The estate was waking up behind them, and ahead of them the grounds opened toward the outer wall and the fields beyond it, and the morning was clear and cold, and there were no more rooms to negotiate, no tables to calculate from, no silences to use as distance. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him for a moment with the morning light full on her face, and her breath still slightly elevated from the run, and her expression open in the way it only was before the day had fully started and the composure had been fully assembled. "The 24 hours, he said. "I need to handle something today. After that—" He stopped, made himself not qualify it, not wrap it in conditions, not protect either of them from it. After that, I want to talk to you, not about the past, about what comes after. She held his gaze. I know I don't have the right to ask that, he said. I know what I took from you, and I know what 12 years cost, and I'm not asking you to set any of that aside. I'm asking for a conversation, after tomorrow, after the wedding. She was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, that was full. Then she said, Handle your 24 hours, Jae-min. She put the earbud back in. She turned and ran. He stood on the path and watched her go and felt his heart doing something in his chest that was completely out of his control. A drumming, irregular, unmanageable thing that no amount of cold arithmetic had ever been able to touch. And then he turned back toward the house, where Soo-yeon was waiting for his call, and the 24 hours had already started, and the cost of what came next was going to be significant and specific, and worth every piece of it if the thing on the other side was what he thought it was. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Cho, and standing in the gravel path in the morning light with Amar's footsteps fading around the garden wall, Kang Jae-min answered it, because the only way through was through, and the only thing on the other side that mattered was the conversation he had not yet been brave enough to finish. Cho answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been holding the phone. I need to meet, Cho said. His voice was different from the restaurant 2 days ago. Tighter, the specific compression of a man who had made a calculation and was no longer certain it had been right. Not through intermediaries, you and me. Where are you? Jae-min said. Gapyeong, same town as last night. A pause. I know you met with Lee. I know you know. That's why you're calling. Silence for 3 seconds. He's not going to hold the terms he offered you. Whatever he said in that room, he's already moved 2 of the Incheon sub-accounts. I found out this morning. Jae-min stopped walking. The gravel was quiet under his feet. Say that again. He moved them last night after your meeting, the Northern Holdings. He initiated the transfer without waiting for your answer. Cho's breathing was audible now, slightly elevated. The breathing of a man who had been sitting with this information for hours and didn't know what to do with it. He was never going to wait 24 hours. The offer was to get you to stand still. The morning was very clear and very cold, and Jae-min stood in it and felt the shape of the last 12 hours rearrange itself into something uglier and more precise. Lee had offered terms he never intended to honor. The 24-hour window wasn't a negotiation. It was a delay. While Jae-min was standing still, Lee was moving. Why are you telling me this? Jae-min said. A long pause. Because he's going to take everything. Not just Incheon. He's been building past Incheon for 6 months. I only understood that this morning when I saw the full structure. Cho's voice was stripped of its usual careful register. What was underneath was something tired and frightened, and beneath that, genuinely ashamed. I made a mistake. I thought I was building leverage, and I was building him a platform. I'm telling you because I'd rather stand in front of you and take what's coming than let him finish it. Jae-min said, Where exactly in Gapyeong? Huh. He drove alone. His 2 men from last night were already in position at 2 of the Incheon sites. He'd arranged that before the meeting, the move he'd told Lee would come in 24 hours. Initiated 6 hours earlier without announcement. That was still in play. But Lee's overnight movement meant the window was narrower than he'd calculated, and narrow windows required decisions that couldn't be delegated. Cho was waiting at a roadside restaurant at the edge of town, the kind of place with plastic chairs and fluorescent light and a menu that hadn't changed since 2009. He was sitting in the back corner with a cold coffee and the face of a man who had not slept and was not pretending otherwise. He was 63 years old, and in the light of that particular morning, looked every year of it. Jae-min sat down across from him. He didn't speak. He waited. Cho put a USB drive on the table between them. Everything, he said. 14 months of transactions, communications, the shell structure Beck built, the accounts Lee controls directly, all of it. He pushed it forward with one finger. I kept copies. Lee doesn't know I kept copies. Jae-min picked it up and held it without looking at it. You were with me for 6 years, he said. Yes. You ran the Eastern accounts for 4 of them. I gave you access to structures that nobody else had access to. Yes? Why? Cho's jaw moved. He looked at the cold coffee. Lee offered me a position in the new structure, something bigger than what I had. He said it without inflection, the way you say things when you're too tired to dress them up. I told myself it was strategic, that I was positioning, that if Lee's play worked, being inside it was better than being run over by it. He looked up. I knew it was a betrayal. I did it anyway. I don't have a better reason than that. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Outside, a truck passed on the county road. Jae-min sat with the USB drive in his hand and looked at the man across from him. The 6 years of shared work, the dinners, the 3 occasions he'd trusted Cho with something that required genuine trust, the specific texture of a professional relationship that had been, he'd believed, solid, and felt the exact weight of what it cost to be wrong about a person. Not surprise. He was past surprise. Just wait. You're going to give me everything on this drive, he said, and you're going to be available for the next 48 hours for whatever I need confirmed or accessed. And then you're done. You don't work in this industry again. Not this side of it. Not any side I have reach into. You disappear from the network completely and quietly, and in exchange I don't do what I would otherwise be entitled to do. He held Cho's gaze. That's the offer. Once. Cho looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes, he said. Okay. Is there anything on this drive that has any connection to anyone in Seongbuk-gu? Any names, any addresses, any reference to persons outside the network? Cho frowned. A genuine frown. No. Lee mentioned the estate once to me, but I told him nothing. I didn't. That part was his own research. I wouldn't have given him that. Jaemin looked at him. I know that doesn't balance the rest of it, Cho said quietly. No, Jaemin said. It doesn't. He stood up, put the drive in his pocket. 48 hours. Don't move without telling Soo-yeon first. He left the restaurant and sat in the car for 2 minutes with both hands on the wheel and his eyes closed, not thinking, just breathing. The particular reset he allowed himself between one thing and the next, the 30 seconds of nothing that kept the cold arithmetic from becoming the only thing he was. Then he called Soo-yeon and told her what he needed. Chant. What followed was 9 hours that he would not describe to anyone in their full detail, not because they were violent, they weren't, or not primarily, but because they required a version of himself that was complete and consuming, that left no room for anything adjacent to it. He worked from the car, from a borrowed office in a building in Mapo, from a call that lasted 90 minutes with 2 men whose cooperation he'd been holding in reserve for 2 years against exactly this kind of situation. The USB drive gave him what he needed to move against Lee's structure from 3 directions simultaneously, none of which Lee would see coming because Lee had been watching Jaemin's front and not his flanks. By 2 in the afternoon, the northern Incheon holdings were frozen, not through Lee's mechanism, but through Jaemin's own, a preemptive legal instrument that Soo-yeon had been holding ready in a different context and that applied with modest creativity to this one. By 4, the shell company Beck had built was structurally compromised, its accounts flagged through a compliance channel that would take months to unravel, and that Lee could not rush without making his own involvement visible. By 6, Jae-min had spoken to Lee directly. A call that lasted 4 minutes and that he made from the parking area of a convenience store on the highway back to Seongbuk. You moved last night, Jae-min said. Lee was quiet for 3 seconds. I protected a position. You told me 24 hours and you moved in 6. I want you to understand what that means for how I handle the rest of this. You've been busy today, Lee said, and the careful warmth was gone from his voice, replaced with something flat and assessing. The Incheon freeze, I heard about it an hour ago. Then you know the position. You can't hold that freeze. The legal basis is it doesn't need to hold forever. It needs to hold for 72 hours. Jae-min watched a family cross the parking lot. 2 adults, a child, a bag of groceries, an ordinary Thursday evening. by which point the compliance review on Bake's structure will have generated enough documentation to make your direct involvement extremely inconvenient to explain. He paused. You're out of Incheon, Taesung. You can accept that cleanly, or we can spend 6 months and significant resources doing this through formal channels, at the end of which you'll be out of Incheon and considerably worse off in other directions. The line was quiet. The estate, Lee said finally. The reference to the estate. I want you to know that was pressure. I know exactly what you would and wouldn't have done, Jae-min said. That's not a conversation I'm interested in having. Give me your answer. Another silence. Longer this time, then, I'll need to see the freeze documentation. Soo-yeon will send it tonight. And Cho is no longer your concern. The call ended. Jae-min sat in the car and felt the 9 hours settle. Not triumph, nothing as clean as that, just the specific exhaustion of a thing finished at the price it cost. The Incheon positions were going to need restructuring regardless. Certain relationships inside the network would need to be rebuilt or released. The exit he'd been planning for 2 years was going to happen on a compressed timeline, whether he'd chosen that or not, and some of what he lost in the compression couldn't be recovered. It was done. He drove back to Seongbuk. The rehearsal dinner was already underway when he arrived. He could hear it from the entrance, voices and music and the specific warmth of a house fully occupied and celebrating. He stood in the front hallway for a moment, still in the jacket, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Huang, appeared from the side corridor and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had seen men come home from difficult things before and had developed a protocol for it. There's a plate kept warm, she said. Upstairs bathroom has towels. Thank you, he said. He went upstairs. He showered. He changed into the suit he'd brought for the rehearsal dinner and stood in the mirror for a moment, looking at the face that looked back at him and thought, this is what the other side of it looks like. Not clean, not rebuilt. Just the day after. The face that remains when the thing is finished. He went downstairs. The dinner was 12 people at the long table, and he slid into his seat quietly enough that only Ethan and Amara noticed immediately. Ethan looked at him once with a question in his eyes, and Jae-min gave a small nod. The nod that meant it's handled, and Ethan's shoulders released a tension he'd been holding since morning. Amara looked at him from across the table with her hands around her water glass and her face carefully neutral, and he met her eyes and held them for 3 seconds, and whatever she read in them made something in her face settle. Not relief exactly, but the specific resolution of an uncertainty. She looked back at Jisoo, who was telling a story about the first time she'd met Ethan's mother, and she laughed at the right moment. And the table was full and warm, and Jae-min sat in the middle of it and ate the meal that had been kept warm for him, and felt, slowly and without ceremony, something in his chest begin to unknot. Marcus, seated 2 places down, met his eye briefly and raised his glass a fraction. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. Jae-min nodded once. After dinner, the group moved to the sitting room, but Jae-min went to the kitchen instead and stood at the counter with a glass of water, and Ethan found him there 10 minutes later, which he'd expected. Done? Ethan said. Done. Cost you? Yes. Ethan nodded. He poured himself a water and stood beside Jae-min at the counter, and they were quiet together the way they had been quiet together in various kitchens over 20 years, which was differently than they were quiet in any other context. The speech, Ethan said finally. I'm giving yours. Good. Mine's better. Ethan set down his glass. She was asking Jisoo about New York tonight. What it would take to spend more time here. He said it carefully, without emphasis, the way you say things when you know the weight of them and don't want to manufacture more. Jisoo told her Seoul has good consulting work for someone with her background, that it wouldn't be impossible. He looked at the countertop. She hasn't said anything to me directly, but she was asking. Jae-min held his water glass and said nothing. I'm not telling you what to do with that, Ethan said. I'm just telling you. I know. Ethan picked up his glass. Come into the sitting room. Jisoo's mother is trying to organize a card game, and nobody's going to survive it without support. Jae-min followed him. Imat. He found a moment with Amara at 9:30 on the back terrace where she'd stepped out for air. The night was clear and cold, and the lights from the sitting room cast a rectangle of warmth across the stone. She was standing at the terrace railing with her arms crossed against the chill, and she heard him come out but didn't turn immediately. He stood beside her. Below, the garden was dark and still. Above, the sky was clear enough to see the rougher stars through the light pollution. "It's over?" she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "You look like it took something." It did. She turned to look at him then, and what she saw in his face made her own expression shift. Not pity, she wasn't built for pity, but something honest and proximate. "Was anyone hurt?" "No." "Are you going to have to do something like that again?" He considered the honest answer. "Within the next 2 years, I'll be out of that side of it entirely. After that, no." She looked at him for a long moment. The chill moved across the terrace between them. "That's the most forward-looking thing you've ever said to me." "I know. 2 years. Give or take." She turned back to the garden. Her thumb moved against her own forearm, a small, unconscious gesture, something she did when she was processing. He'd noticed it in the cafe. He'd noticed it 12 years ago. "I talked to Jisoo tonight about soul," she said. "I heard." She looked at him sharply. "Ethan told me. Not the content, just that you were asking." Her expression moved through something. Then she looked back at the garden. "I wasn't asking because of you," she said. "I want you to know that. I have work here that I've been putting off for professional reasons that had nothing to do with you. Projects I've declined because soul felt complicated." She paused. "I'm thinking about uncomplicated it, for my own reasons." "Okay," he said. "I'm not asking for anything from you." "I know. I'm just telling you because—" She stopped. "Because after the car and the cafe and the hallway last night, it feels dishonest not to." She breathed out slowly. "And I'm tired of things feeling dishonest between us." He turned to face her. She was still looking at the garden, her jaw set, her profile in the low light from the sitting room clear and still. He thought about the 10 years he'd spent in rooms full of powerful men and the specific fear that none of them had ever been able to produce in him, and the particular fear that this woman on a cold terrace produced without effort. Not of losing, but of finally having something to lose. "Amara," he said. She turned. "When I said try," he said, "in the sitting room Tuesday night, when you asked if I could let you get through this week." He held her eyes. "I should have said yes. I should have given you the clean answer and protected you from the rest of it. I know that. You were being honest. I was being a coward with better vocabulary." He didn't look away. "I've been honest with you in pieces this week because honest in full it's harder than I know how to do. But I'm going to try to say it in full now, and you can do whatever you want with it." She was very still. "I have been in love with you for 15 years, he said. "Not 12. 15. Since before you told me. I understood what it was the summer before you said anything to me, and I spent a year convincing myself it was something I could manage, and then you came to my office and said the thing I'd been trying not to hear, and I sent you away." He felt the words cost what they cost, and didn't slow down. "I built an empire for 12 years, partly because controlling something large enough was the only thing that made the specific silence feel purposeful. That's not your fault, and it's not something I'm asking you to carry. I'm just telling you the full truth finally, because you've been carrying an incomplete version of it for 12 years, and it's mine to correct." The sitting room behind them was warm and audible. Beyond the terrace, the garden was dark and quiet. Amara looked at him, and he watched the full accounting of it move through her face. The old wound, the 12 years, the cafe, the 24 hours, the gravel path this morning, all of it in sequence. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the specific brightness of someone receiving something they have waited for so long they had stopped expecting it. 15 years, she said. "Yes." She breathed out once, slow. "You are the most exhausting man I have ever known in my life." "I know." 15 years, Jaemin." She shook her head, a small movement, something between disbelief and something that was almost laughter. "What were you doing for 15 years?" "Building things to avoid thinking about it." "Did it work?" "No." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold settled around them and neither of them moved. Then she uncrossed her arms and turned fully toward him and said, "You have 2 years to finish what you need to finish, and I'm going to take the soul project. And we're going to do this slowly because I'm not the 24-year-old who walked into your office and offered you everything without a plan. I know what I need now, and I know what I'm not willing to give up. And if we're going to do this, we do it on terms that work for both of us, not just for your timeline or your fears or your very extensive empire." She held his gaze. "Are those terms you can work with?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation this time, the way he should have said yes Tuesday night, when she asked something smaller and got his uncertainty instead. She nodded once. Then she held out her hand. Not for a handshake, just open. An offering. He took it. Her hand was cold from the terrace air, and his was warmer, and the contact was quiet and completely without performance. And they stood there for a moment in the rectangle of light from the sitting room with the garden dark below them and the night clear above. And it was not a scene from the life he'd spent 15 years building, and not a scene from the life he was trying to build toward, but something in between, something that belonged only to this specific terrace and this specific cold and this one night after the storm. Tishi. The wedding was on Saturday. The morning came in with the same clean light that had marked Thursday, the sky fully clear, the autumn delivering the particular gift of a perfect day with no negotiation required. The estate was organized chaos from 7 a.m. Florists and caterers, and Jisu's sister ironing something in the second-floor hallway, and Ethan's mother directing everything from the kitchen with a clipboard she'd obtained from somewhere. Jamin was dressed by 9 and stood at the window of his guest room and looked at the garden where the chairs had been set up in rows, white against the grass. The flower arrangements that Amara had chosen and he had paid for, and Mrs. Bayek had prepared lined along the aisle in the cream and white that Jisu had specified. It looked like the thing it was, a person's best day, arranged with care, held by the people who had decided to be present for it. He went downstairs and found Ethan in the study. Ty not yet nodded, looking at the window. "Ready?" Jamin said. Ethan turned around. "No," he said. "Entirely no." And then he grinned, and it was the grin from 20 years ago, the one from the first semester, the one that had not aged at all. "Help me with this tie." Jamin crossed the room and knotted his tie with the precision of someone who had been doing it for other people since he was 17, and Ethan stood still and let him, and neither of them said anything for the duration of it because everything had already been said, and the rest was just ceremony. "The speech," Ethan said. "I've memorized it." "You're giving yours, not mine." Jamin paused. "You said mine was wrong." "I said they were all wrong. That's different from yours being worse than mine." He looked at himself in the small mirror by the bookshelf and then at Jamin. "What did the third version say? The one you said was probably still wrong?" Jamin considered it. "It said that 20 years ago I met the person who made me understand that being powerful and being good were two different things, and that he'd been trying to teach me the difference ever since." He paused. "And that watching him choose Jisoo was the first time I understood that the lesson had sunk in somewhere. That if I could see a good choice when someone else made it, maybe I was closer to making one myself." Ethan looked at him. "That's not wrong," he said quietly. "It's not finished." "So finish it." Jamin thought about the terrace, the cold, the hand. "I think I might be able to now," he said. The ceremony was 30 minutes and held every person in it from the first word to the last. Jisoo cried, which nobody had predicted, including Jisoo, and it made Ethan cry, which everyone had predicted, and his mother held herself together with the dignity of a woman who had decided that this was her son's day, and her feelings could wait until the drive home. Marcus sat 2 rows back and was visibly moved in the unguarded way of someone who wasn't trying not to be. Amara stood at the edge of the wedding party in a deep burgundy dress with her hair up and the thin-framed glasses and the bracelet on her wrist. Cream ribbon, a small silver crane charm that Jamin had left on her windowsill that morning in a small box with no note, because the note wasn't necessary. And she watched her brother marry the woman who made him better, and she held herself together until the vows, and then she didn't, quietly and without calling attention to it. Jamin gave the speech at the reception. He gave the third version with the ending he hadn't had when he wrote it. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is being said that people recognize as true. And at the end of it, Ethan stood up and embraced him in front of 70 guests in the way that only 20 years of actual brotherhood can produce, without embarrassment, without performance, just the full weight of it. He sat back down. Amara was across the table. She was looking at him. She wasn't trying not to. He reached across and touched the bracelet on her wrist, one finger briefly, the way you confirm something real. She turned her hand and held his for 3 seconds before she let go, and he felt that 3 seconds in the full length of his chest, from his throat to somewhere beneath his sternum, and understood that this was what it felt like when you stopped running. Not peace exactly, nothing as simple as that, but solidity. The specific weight of a life that was finally, at 41, starting to belong to the person living it. Late that night, after the last guests had moved inside and the caterers were taking down the tables, and the garden lights were still strung between the trees, they sat on the low garden wall together. Not the terrace, not the kitchen, not any of the rooms that had held their difficult conversations. The garden itself, outside, on a wall that was cold and slightly rough, with the lights above them swaying faintly in the night air. She had her shoes off. He had his jacket over her shoulders. They talked for a long time, not about the past, or not only, about the Soul Project, which was a corporate restructure for a media company that she'd been considering for 4 months and had called to accept that afternoon from the side garden while the reception was still running. About the Kangstone expansion and what legitimate work actually looked like at this scale, and what she thought about the governance structure from the outside, which was pointed and accurate and made him write 2 things in his phone. About Marcus, who had said goodbye after dinner with a handshake for Jamin that was genuine and without subtext, and who had told Amara on his way out that he was glad she'd found what she was looking for, and meant it. About the woman named Sun Yeon-hee, who had died at 29, and the decision Jae-min had made in the aftermath, and whether it had been the right one. He said he didn't know. He said he'd been certain for 12 years and was less certain now. She said that uncertainty about a past decision was different from having made it wrongly, and he said he wasn't sure that distinction helped the people the decision affected. She said, "You affected me, and I'm telling you it helps." He was quiet with that for a while. At some point, the lights in the main house went off floor by floor. At some point, the caterers finished, and the garden was quiet. She leaned into him at some point, not dramatically, just a shift of weight, the way people do when they've been holding themselves upright for a long time and have finally decided to stop. His arm came around her, also not dramatically, also just the natural conclusion of 2 people sitting on a cold wall deciding they'd done enough managing of distance for one lifetime. "I wasted a lot of time," he said. "We both did." "Mostly me." "Mostly you," she agreed. And there was something in the way she said it, dry and precise and completely without cruelty, that sounded enough like the beginning of something to make him exhale for what felt like the first time in days. He looked at the garden lights. The crane charm on her bracelet caught one of them and held it for a moment, a small silver point of light in the dark. "First date," he said. "When you're settled in Seoul. I'm going to have conditions." I assumed. "You carry the flowers." He thought about the car from Gapyeong, the weight of the flower boxes, the way she'd talked to Mrs. Bake with the ease of someone who'd done their research. "Okay," he said, "and you tell me things. When something is happening. Not all of it. I understand there are things I won't be told, and I can work with that. But when something is costing you, I want to know. Not after. During." He thought about Tuesday night. The sitting room. "I'll try." "Yes," he said. Not try. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What was the first one? The first moment?" He knew what she was asking. 15 years, she'd said on the terrace. "Your brother's birthday dinner," he said. "The July before your final year. You argued with me about infrastructure privatization for 40 minutes, and you were wrong about half of it, and completely right about the rest, and you knew exactly which half was which." She was quiet. "You didn't apologize for the wrong half," he said. "You just said, okay, I missed that and moved on. Like being wrong about something wasn't a referendum on whether you were worth listening to. He paused. I'd never met anyone who did that. She turned to look at him. In the garden light, her face was close and clear and entirely present. You've been carrying that specific memory for 15 years. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You are going to have to work very hard to deserve this. I know. I'm not going to make it easy. I'd be suspicious if you did. She looked at him a moment longer, then she turned back to the garden, and he felt her settle slightly against his side. And the lights above them moved in the faint night air, and somewhere in the main house someone was still awake, and the night was cold and clear and long. Kang Jae-min had spent 41 years building things that could not be taken from him, and had learned on a cold garden wall that the only things worth building were the ones that required you to remain visible while you built them. Not powerful, not controlled, just present and honest and willing to carry the flowers. The first date was 6 weeks later. He was 20 minutes early. He stood outside her building with an armful of roses that was larger than the situation required, not because he'd intended excess, but because he'd stood in the flower shop for 11 minutes, unable to decide, and had eventually just taken what he was holding. The shop owner had been professional about it. Amara came out of the building and stopped on the steps and looked at him with the full weight of everything the past 6 weeks had been. The first phone calls, the first dinner, the first version of them that existed in the ordinary light of a life rather than the compressed extraordinary of a crisis week. And then she looked at the flowers, which were considerable, and she laughed. Not the careful version, the full one, low, genuine, surprised out of her. He stood on the sidewalk holding an unreasonable quantity of roses and felt it hit him in the chest, the same way it had in Gapyeong in the rain, the same way it had across 12 years of trying not to think about it, and understood that some things don't diminish with time. They just wait, patient and permanent, for the person carrying them to stop running. He held out his hand. She came down the steps and took it. They walked.